Afternoon and welcome to the Leeds Civic Trust first in your lunch hour talk for 2022. My name's Mark Parry and these lectures will be given by Dr. Kevin Grady. We'll have a brief question and answer session at the end for you. So any questions you think of during the talk, please type them in the chat facility rather than the Q&A facility. So that's the chat facility. We're recording this so people can watch it at a time to suit themselves later. So you can go to the Leeds Civic Trust website to see the link. The Leeds Civic Trust has been running these lectures for many years, traditionally in the Holy Trinity Church in Boar Lane in Leeds, where they attracted up to 200 people. During the lockdown last year, we presented them online for the first time and attracted many more people, with some people being from outside the UK. If you are watching from outside the UK, you're very welcome, and we'd love to know which country you are, so please enter the name of your country in the chat. Today's talk is on the history of Briggate, beginning in 1207, when Maurice Paynel created the manorial borough of Leeds, very nearby the existing village in Kirkgate. Today, we know this new town as Briggate. This lecture traces the history of this fascinating historic street, which remains at the heart of civic life. So, Kevin, over to you.
Yes, thank you, John. Or Mark, should I say. So I'm just looking at the numbers of people still coming in. We're up to 217 now. So I shall share my screen and we'll see how we get on. In fact, I'll just wait and see whether how the numbers are ticking up. I think we're at 1 minute past 1, so perhaps we'll just allow a few more people to appear. A question in the chat says, can other people hear? I hope people can hear. If you can hear, please type into the chat so that we can be sure that this is transmitting okay. Yes, Jackie DePell says that she can hear okay. Oh yes, Kate Newell can hear, Dorothy and panelists, and Stephen Lunn can hear, and Chris Wallbank. It's so very nice to see the names of all sorts of friends and Civic Trust members and others. So it seems to be working. Right, we're now up to 237. Oh, somebody said they were from Hull. Yes, we're still going. We're up to 238 now, so I think that it would be fairly safe. Robert Sladden is there. Very nice to see you're there, Robert. Robert was Director of Estates for Leeds University. Oh, somebody from Canterbury, that's very encouraging. And John Barraclough, yes, is there. We're now up to 241. I said, oh, somebody's from Reading, Elizabeth Trout. Gwen Thomas from Huddersfield. Somebody tuning in from Wales, rather, yes. Okay, so we're up to 243 now. So, oh yes, they're still coming in. So I think we've been quite smart off the mark. So I shall actually get into lecture mode and get started. As Mark has said, if you have questions, please type them into the chat function. Or somebody from Selby, another person from York, Cherwell. Yes, we're up to the about 350 mark now. I think there are probably about 300 plus people who registered, so we'll wait and see. So I shall start now, come out of chat, and with any luck, I shall share my screen. Right, so there we are then. I hope you'll all be able to see it. Right, so I'm Kevin Grady, as you know, former director of the Civic Trust, and thank you to Mark for that kind introduction. It's wonderful I can't see you all, but it's wonderful to know that you are all there. I'm delighted that this is the start of my 15th annual series of lunch hour lectures. It seems remarkable to me that quite literally exactly 2 years ago today, many of us were sat in Holy Trinity Church, in Leeds Minster, and though we'd vaguely heard that there was some sort of virus in China, we were actually all relaxed and had no notion of social distancing, and that within 4 weeks of my final lecture, life for us all had changed dramatically. Well, thanks to the miracle of Zoom, the tradition of my lectures has gone on. And with COVID easing significantly now, fingers crossed, I look forward to giving my lectures in person to a live audience and lots of you next year. Can I begin this year's lecture series by thanking the Thoresby Society and Leeds City Libraries and Leeds Museums and Galleries for allowing me to use many images which you will see today. Now, my first 2 lectures this year focus on the history and development of Briggate. This is not simply because Briggate has been part of city life for over 800 years, but because, of course, at the moment, Briggate is in the news to some extent, because tremendous work is taking place in New Briggate under an English Heritage or Historic England funded scheme to promote the regeneration of that street. Today's lecture gives a broad outline of the development of Briggate over 8 centuries, while next week, with the very exciting title of When the Streets Ran with Blood, focuses on the development of the area where the Victoria Quarter and the County Arcade now stand. So I should say that lecture next week may not be for vegetarians, but who knows. So 800 years is a long time to cover in 55 minutes. So at times, having highlighted the notable aspects of the story of Briggate in 1 century, I will jump rather rapidly and abruptly into another century. Right, the thing's working. William the Conqueror's great Doomsday Survey of England in 1086 tells us that after the Norman conquest, William gave the relatively large agricultural manor of Leeds to the Norman Baron Hilbert de Lacy. This slide shows my colleague Stephen Burt's reconstruction of the layout of the manor in 1086, which he based on surviving manorial records and maps and plans of Leeds from the mid-16th century onwards. It shows the village of Leeds based on Kergate, running west from the parish church. Domesday Book tells us that Leeds had a priest and a church. As you can see, there were 2 large systems of open fields, the land of which was divided into ridge and furrow ploughing strips, which were distributed between the peasant farmers. These were the open fields of Woodhouse to the north and Nostrop to the east. Other outlying features were the common land of Woodhouse Moor, familiar to us today, and Woodhouse Ridge. And also there was a great deal of waste land within the manor. Other key features were a moated manor house, a small manorial hunting park to the west of the manor house, a manorial corn mill, and meadowland close to the river. There was also a manorial demesne or home farm, a major part of which lay on land which corresponds to today's shopping centre. Well, what of the inhabitants of the manor? The peasant farmers and their families and dependents probably constituted a population of only 200 people. So this was a very thinly populated area. Here we see another of Stephen's plans showing the town of Leeds about 400 years later in 1500. Shortly after 1086, the manor of Leeds was granted to a wealthy Norman baron, Ralph Paynel. Now, this was a very significant thing because this grant was followed by a process of asset stripping. In 1899, in an act of piety, Ralph gave to Holy Trinity Priory in York, he gave to the Priory Leeds Parish Church and its income and the village immediately around it, plus some land in Holbeck. Ralph's son later gave one of the manor's most lucrative assets, the manorial corn mill, and its income to Drax Priory, which he had founded in East Yorkshire. So for our purposes, the significance of all this is that when Maurice Paynel inherited the manor around 1200, he already had pressing debts, and he found himself with a manor which was mortgaged and impoverished. The big question for him was, how could he make some money out of the manor of Leeds? He decided what lots of manorial lords were doing across Europe in this period. He decided to attempt to generate income by establishing a small town or manorial borough within the manor of Leeds. He hoped that by granting the privilege of being free to follow a trade or craft, he could encourage skilled craftsmen and tradesmen to settle in this new borough, and that they would pay high rents for the building plots he gave to them. He also had some notion that he could establish and create a prosperous market in the borough, which would generate lucrative market tolls. So, on the 12th of November 1207, Maurice Paynel granted a charter creating the manorial borough of Leeds, a new town grafted on to the west end of Kirkgate, as we see in this plan. The borough was to extend from the southern boundary of the Woodhouse open fields down to the important crossing point on the River Aire, where Leeds Bridge now stands. As the plan shows, he laid out 30 burgage plots on either the side of a new street, which later became known as Briggate. The inhabitants living on these plots were known as burgesses, and their plots were known as burgage plots. Because the burgesses were to be townsmen engaging in crafts and trade, and were not intended to be peasant farmers working on strips of ploughland in the open fields, they were also each given a half-acre allotment where they could grow food. These allotments were situated at a place which today we know as Bermontofts, that is, burgage men's tofts. The burgesses were free, meaning that instead of paying in kind for the right to occupy their burgesses by performing compulsory labour services on the lord's manor, they paid a fixed money rent of 16 pence per annum. Significant for the future form of Briggate, the charter permitted the burgesses to subdivide their burgages and indeed to sell them. Finally, since the street was unusually wide, without doubt, Maurice Paynel did intend that it should become a marketplace, although there's no reference to a market actually in the charter. Today, the layout of the medieval burgage plots is still clearly discernible in the Briggate yards and arcades. The plots were all the same width, that is 3 perches, 3/4 of a chain, that is 49.5 feet. The depths of the plots varied between 10 and 18 perches. The earliest cartographical representation of the burgage plots is on what you see in front of you, John Cuzzens' new and exact plan of Leeds, published in 1726. The longest burgage plots were 18 perches long and lay between Briggate and Land's Lane to the west. On Cuzzens' plan, we see the uncovered alleyways, you see them on the left, a bit like dog's legs, uncovered alleyways emerging from the burgage plots. The distance between each of these alleyways was almost exactly 3 perches. Now, several of these plots can be seen in Briggate today. So here we have, first of all, Thornton's Arcade. This is 49.5 feet wide. We go to the next building, different in architectural character, the North Face building, but 49.5 feet wide. If we go lower down, a little bit further down on the west side, here we have Lloyd's Bank, and you know what I'm going to say, it's 49.5 feet wide. So these were built on medieval burgage plots. Well, 49.5 feet is a very broad frontage. The first burgesses probably only built their houses on part of the frontage and had access to the side to their long gardens behind. But over the years, as the plots became subdivided or sublet, the frontages became entirely built up, and it was necessary to create arched passageways through the frontages to give rear access. Also over time, the gardens were built on for a variety of uses and to provide access for different users. The yard forms that we know today developed. Between the Lloyd's Bank building and the North Face building, there are 4 buildings, as you can see here. But when we look more closely, 4 buildings equals 2 burgage plots. Fat Face and the Phone Clinic building occupy 1 plot, and Ollie Quinn and the office form the front of the Queen's Arcade, occupying another plot. If we go further down Briggate on the left-hand side, we arrive at what in 2007 was still the Burton's Arcade. Inevitably, it's 49.5 feet wide. Now, when Trinity Shopping Centre was built, the Trust was very worried about what was going to happen. So we basically buttonholed Gerald Jennings and said, when you demolish the top shop, you must make the right-hand frontage of the new Trinity Shopping Centre 49.5 feet wide. And as you can see from the photograph at the top left, that actually happened. Well, moving down to Lower Briggate and to the east side of the street, we come to the building which was formerly the Royal Hotel. Now it's West Row House, and it stands on another burgage plot. Well, I could go on, but incidentally, Briggate, the word Briggate, is a combination of brick, the Old English word for bridge, and garter or gator, the Old Norse word for a way or a street. Clearly, the name is ancient, but I can find no written use of the name before the manorial survey of 1548. Right, we must move on. Let's now look at the life and development of Briggate from 1207 to the end of the Tudor period. Here we see Leeds and Briggate as it was depicted in the first surviving plan of Leeds, which dates from 1560 and was produced because of a legal dispute about the right to operate water mills. You can see Briggate running up north from Leeds Bridge to the Hedgerow, and Kirkgate can be seen running off to the right. The location of the manor house is shown, as is that of the manorial water mill, referred to here as Queen's Mill. Time does not permit me to describe the evolution of the manorial borough between 1207 and 1600, except to say that it developed into a market town and a centre of woolen cloth making of some note. John Leyland noted the importance of the cloth industry to Leeds when making his famous tour of England, begun in 1534. He observed, Leedis, 2 miles lower than Christal Abbey on the River Aire, is a pratty market, having one parish church, reasonably well builded, and as large as Bradford, but not so quick. The town standeth by clothing. By 1600, Leeds had become a town of significant importance with a population of around 4,000. It's from the beginning of the 17th century that we get the first really detailed descriptions of Briggate and the visual evidence of what it was like. Before giving you a contemporary written description of what Briggate was like in the 1630s, I thought I'd show you this panorama dating from about 50 years later, which gives you a good impression of what Briggate must have looked like as a prosperous, rapidly growing market town during the 17th century. This is the central section of William Lodge's Prospect of Leeds, drawn around 1685, and it provides the first image of Briggate. Indeed, it focuses on the Briggate buildings running up from the bridge to St. John's Church. We see the river sweeping around the bottom of the picture, with tenter frames shown on the meadows. We see Leeds Bridge with the cloth market taking place on it, and then the parish church behind it. And then we see the buildings, some of them large, running up the ridge of Briggate, past the market cross, which just peeps out a little bit, a black symbol towards the left-hand side, past the market cross to St. John's Church, with the height of its tower greatly exaggerated. So the first written description of Briggate was occasioned in 1628 by the visit of surveyors from the Corporation of London, which had recently acquired the manor with many other manors from King Charles I in settlement of his debts. To illustrate this description, I'm using the wonderful map of Leeds drawn by John Cousins. The basic form of the town of Leeds had not changed significantly in the previous 100 years. The commissioners were not overly impressed with some parts of Briggate, as we shall see. I quote, they said, Leeds is an ancient market town. It standeth pleasantly in a fruitful and enclosed vale, upon the north side of the river Aire, over or beyond the stone bridge, from whence it hath a large broad street, paved with stone, they like that, leading directly north and continually ascending. This mid-19th century view of some 16th century timber-framed houses on the west side of Lower Briggate, just below Ball Lane, though recased in brick, give us an impression of what the commissioners had seen. They continued, the houses on both sides thereof are very thick and close compacted together, being ancient, mean, and low built. Of course, remember, they'd come from London, and generally all of timber. Though they have stone quarries frequent in the town and about it, only some few of the richer sort of inhabitants have their houses more large and capacious, yet all low and straightened on their backsides. There was pressure of space on the Briggate frontages, and so, especially near the cloth market, and so there were some large jettied timber framed houses that were built in the yards of Briggate. Here we see a 19th century view of Lambert's house in Lambert's Yard on the east side of Lower Briggate, just above Queen's Court. You can see in this view the arched passageway on the right, which took you back into Briggate. This house is still there and is the last intact timber-framed house in Leeds city centre. This photo was taken in 2007. Continuing the surveyor's description, in the middle of the street, towards the upper end, where the marketplace standeth, is built the moot house, or court, as they termed it, and from thence upwards are the shambles, with a narrow street on both sides, much annoying the whole town, yet for their conveniency and want of room not to be avoided or placed elsewhere. The manor is all enclosed and lieth in very small parcels, as some half an acre, some 2 acres, some more, many less, having houses scattered frequently and through the whole lordship, by reason of their great clothing, on which trade the whole town chiefly, and in a manner wholly, dependeth. By this time, Leeds had a rapidly growing but newly established woolen cloth merchant community. The court or moot house referred to by the surveyors had been built in the centre of Briggate, just above Kergate, in 1615, and was a sign that the woolen cloth merchant community was keen to improve the amenities of the town. The surveyors had also referred to the butcher's shambles in the middle of Briggate, just beyond the moot hall. This remarkable survival, an early 19th century view, shows the shambles pretty much as the surveyors must have seen them 200 years earlier. This view shows the east side of them. Note the timber framing, the butcher's shops on the ground floor, and particularly the galleries on the first floor. In practice, these were a rather third-rate version of the Rose in Chester. Naturally, in the 17th century, merchants wanted to have their houses on the principal street close to the cloth market or marketplace. As the surveyors said, most of the houses along Briggate were timber framed, but this did not necessarily mean that they were unimposing. Here is the house built in 1615 for Richard Sykes, one of the richest and most influential cloth merchants in Leeds. The house stood on the west side of Briggate, almost opposite Kergate. Its passageway led into the Packhorse Yard, which of course is still there today. As this photo proves, this house managed to survive for 340 years before it was demolished in 1955 for extensions to Timpson's shoe shop. Next to Maurice Paynel, the second most influential person in the development of Briggate was John Harrison. In the early 17th century, Yorkshire's traditional centres of merchanting, York, Beverley, those sort of places, complained of competition from a newly emerged group of youthful, thrusting woolen cloth merchants in Leeds. Perhaps the most dynamic of these young adventurers was John Harrison, who enjoyed making money, but as well spending it in improving the town and in doing various good works. Harrison built a large merchant house on Briggate on a burgage plot in 1603. He was only 24 years old at that point, and subsequently went on to own 5 burgage plots. And in addition, he endowed the marketplace with a market cross. And in 1634, he erected St. John's Church, which of course is still there, one of the best 17th century churches in England. At the same time as building the church, Harrison created the new street, which we can see on here, to provide access to the church. And in the street, he built houses and cottages, the rental income from which was to be used to support what he called pious uses. Above all, he built Harrison's Hospital, and you can see it on the left of the church, a set of almshouses just by the church. Looking at this view, note not only the new street and the almshouses, but also the house to the right of the church, because I'm going to be returning to that later. We now jump into the 18th century. Here we see part of Francis Place's prospect of Leeds drawn in 1715. It shows the river and the lower part of the town. The reason merchants wanted to have their houses on Briggate was because of its prestige and its closeness to the celebrated cloth market, which was held on Leeds Bridge in the 17th century, and then because it grew so large, moved into Lower Briggate in the 1680s. By the early 18th century, the Briggate street market as a whole was reckoned by some to be the largest in the north of England, not only for cloth, but also as a general market. Now, Daniel Defoe in the 1720s provided a wonderful description of the cloth market in Lower Briggate, to which literally thousands of West Riding clothiers brought their cloth for sale on Tuesdays and Saturdays. I'd love to have the time to read you the description, but it would take quite a long time. So on this occasion, I want to let your hero and mine, Ralph Thoresby, the great Leeds antiquarian, to describe the marketplace to us from his topographical history of Leeds, Ducatus Leodiensis, which he published in 1715. He says, "The famous cloth market, the life not of the town alone, but these parts of England, is held in this street twice every week, viz. Upon Tuesdays and Saturdays, early in the morning, where several £1000s worth of broadcloth are bought, and generally speaking paid for in a few hours' time. And this with so profound a silence as is surprising to strangers, who from the adjoining galleries can hear no more noise than the lowly murmur of the merchant upon the Exchange of London. Indeed, as the merchants walked up and down the rows of trestle tables to buy cloth, the bargaining was all done in whispers. It must have been a wonderful spectacle. When a deal was done, the clothiers carried the cloth to the merchant's house and into his yard, where his warehouses and finishing shops were. Here we see the magnificent 8-bayed merchant house erected about 1720 for the Oates family in Lower Briggate. Today, we know it as Queen's Court, and I took this photograph only a couple of days ago. After the signal, Thoresby proceeds. And this view is of the yard of Queen's Court, an old one, black and white one. We're looking through the entrance from Briggate, and we see the warehouses and finishing shops of the Oates family, and on the right some examples of what was happening there with the croppers and the primers and raising the nap. Thoresby then proceeds to describe the rest of the market. After this, and he says, after the signal is given by the bell at the old chapel by the bridge, the cloth and benches are removed so that the street is at liberty for the market people of other professions, such as the country linen drapers, shoemakers, hardware men, and the sellers of wooden vessels, wicker baskets, wanded chairs, and fruit of all sorts. Above the market for the milk cows, is the market for fish, which, notwithstanding its great distance from the sea, is weekly thrice or twice plentifully furnished with a great variety of fish. Thoresby continues, a little above this is the moot hall in the front of the middle row, on one side of which, on the right that is the best furnished flesh shambles in the north of England, on the other, the wool market for broadcloth. From the market cross, which is well stocked with poultry and other appurtenances, to the new street is the corn market, which is very considerable. He then describes the markets for other types of goods which are scattered around the streets of the town. The moot hall, as we see it here, had been rebuilt in 1710. Above the ground floor was a hall where the Leeds Corporation held its meetings and the Borough and West Riding justices of the peace held their quarter sessions. John Cusson's wonderful new and exact plan of Leeds in 1726 is a celebration of civic pride in booming Leeds, one of the most prosperous cloth marketing towns in the kingdom. By this time, the population had reached about 9,000 and was steadily growing. Its merchants were rich, and in the first 2 decades of the century, they were showing off their wealth by building fine new townhouses, especially on Briggate. Several of these houses are shown in the margins of John Cusson's plan. Well, we've already seen the Oates house, although it's not actually on this plan, but I want to show you 2 of the newly built Briggate houses which are on the plan. First, we see Thomas Lee's very imposing house on the west side of Lower Briggate with its 9 bays and 3 stories. In fact, this house survived for 250 years and can be seen amidst this long row of merchant houses of the period. This is a 1973 view, and you can see that this complete row of merchant houses in Lower Briggate survived, what seems until relatively recently to me, and sadly, of course, they're not there anymore. In this next view, we see on the right, we see 2 other merchant houses in this area. On the left, in the postcard, we see the 3-story merchant house. And on the right, we see the merchant house which subsequently became Dyson's Jewellers. Its early Georgian date is revealed by the fact that on either of its outer edges, it has vertical columns of stone coins. Another house of the period which happily has survived entirely intact is Matthew Wilson's house, a 3-story house which we saw on the Cussons plan next to St. John's Church. Today it stands opposite the Grand Theatre and we know it as Nash's Tudor Fish Restaurant. The rapid growth of the West Riding wool and cloth industry in the 18th century meant that Briggate just couldn't cope with the volume of clothiers attending its markets, and moreover, the clothiers and the merchants wanted better accommodation. By the 1750s, the cloth market had moved into the Leeds cloth halls, but Briggate continued, and so more space was created, but Briggate continued to thrive as a retail and wholesale marketplace and was thronged with people and shops. The dominant feature of Briggate above Kirkgate was the Moot Hall, but the next most prominent features were its coaching inns. There was a transport revolution in the 18th century. canals and river navigations were its most prominent feature, but the turnpiking of roads happened in a big way, and therefore there were now coaches whizzing around the country in every direction. Briggate became a hive of coaching activity, with several large coaching inns occupying its yards and frontages. Here we see John Harrison's house, refronted as the King's Arms Coaching Inn. It stood on the east side of the street, just above Duncan Street. The Rose and Crown on the site of the present-day Queen's Arcade was another important coaching inn. And finally, we see the Bull and Mouth, where the House of Fraser store stands today on the east side of Briggate below Kergate. Writing about Briggate in the second half of the 18th century, Ray, the Methodist historian, talks about the wagon warehouses associated with the King's Arms and the Bull and Mouth inns, and how the wagons starting from these places, were loaded on the east side of the street, and a great proportion of the east side of the street in their immediate vicinity was covered with empty hogsheads, casks, and boxes. The late 18th century brought to Briggate the bow-fronted Georgian shops, familiar to us from Quality Street chocolate boxes. On the right of the three bow-fronted shops in this view, you can just see the start of the Queen's Court building. In the second half of the 18th century, the trade of Leeds expanded dramatically. Leeds merchants dominated the West Riding wool and cloth industry, and by 1770, incredibly, Leeds merchants were handling half of all the wool and cloth exported from this country. In this period, the town's population grew dramatically, doubling from around 15,000 to 30,000. Now, the biggest consequence of this growth was the infilling of the Briggate burgage plots. The Giles map of 1815, which we see here, is the first map drawn at such a scale and in sufficient detail, not only to show all the Briggate yards, but to name many of them. All the burgage plots, gardens had now become yards filled with buildings, and there were literally dozens of inns in them. Hundreds of houses were built in the yards. And here we see the Turk's Head Yard today. Whitelocks, the pub that now occupies it, is the best surviving example of the infilling for housing. Its cottages, now part of the pub, date from the 1790s. Interestingly, this pub occupied half a burgage plot. We now turn briefly to Briggate in the 19th century. The major issue which needed to be addressed was that though the removal of the cloth market to the cloth halls in the 1750s had temporarily relieved congestion of the street, it had grown even more busy. Briggate and its yards were increasingly thronged with market stalls, shops, inns, houses, and of course, traffic, including all these coaches. But there'd been no fundamental improvement to the thoroughfare itself during the 18th century. Major change came in the 1820s. The great problem was the Moot Hall and Middle Row, which almost blocked the street at one end. Leeds Corporation had been keen to remove the Moot Hall and Middle Row, but they would need a replacement town hall. And where were the butchers going to go? Of the 114 butchers in Leeds Township in 1822, 53 of them were in or near the shambles. The issue, etc., The replacement of the town hall was solved when in 1813 the courthouse was opened in Park Row. The matter of finding a new home for the butchers was solved when in 1822 two butchers, the Rinder brothers, came forward with a scheme to build a new shambles known as the Bazaar and Shambles on some burgage plots on the east side of Briggate, just to the side of the existing shambles. Here we see the Bazaar and Shambles, opened in 1825, which consisted of two alleyways of butcher shops with a large central building between them, on the upper floor of which was the bazaar. Now you're going to hear a lot about this next week. In 1825, the Moot Hall and Middle Row were finally demolished at a cost of £15,000. Here we see Upper Briggate around 1830, after the Moot Hall and the Middle Row had been removed. What an improvement. Incidentally, the building at the top is not the Moot Hall, but a new corn exchange. Running parallel to these improvements was the removal of the wholesale fruit and vegetable market from Briggate. Under the powers of the 1824 Improvement Act, the Improvement Commissioners bought the Vicar's Field in Kirkgate, Vicar's Croft, and moved the Briggate fruit and vegetable market there. This was to be the beginning of Kirkgate Market, which still occupies that site today. There was another market which was clinging tight to its site in Briggate. From time immemorial, the corn market had been held in the open space at the top of Briggate. As you know, the 1820s were a heady time for building development in Leeds, and when a threat came to move the corn market elsewhere, the shop owners at the top of Briggate and the corn factors raised the money to build an elegant corn exchange, which we see here, which faced down Briggate, although it was actually built on the north side of the hedgerow in what today is the entrance to New Briggate. We must now jump into the early Victorian period. With the onset of the 1830s, Briggate had ceased to be the principal street of a very large market town, but was now serving what was rapidly becoming a large industrial town, as this view shows, a city of factories and railways, with the working classes packed in rows and rows of back-to-back houses. Briggate in the mid-19th century was very much a residential street, as well as being a principal shopping and market street. The 1839 Leeds Trade Directory lists 178 properties in Briggate, and 9 out of 10 of them had people living there, primarily living above the shop. It had a wonderful mixture of shops. The 1853 Trade Directory listed 46 shops to do with dress, that is tailors, milliners, hosiers, furriers, and drapers. There were 21 grocers and tea dealers. There were 19 butchers, 4 fruiterers, 10 booksellers, 10 sellers and makers of boots and shoes, 6 jewelers, and many other miscellaneous shops. In the second half of the 19th century, Briggate improved in many ways. In 1857, the Kirkgate Covered Market was opened and brought to an end the Briggate Street Market. On the 30th of November 1857, 650 years after Maurice Paynel had created the Briggate Marketplace, the council decreed that the placing of stalls, benches, goods, wares, or merchandise in Briggate was indefinitely prohibited. Leeds had a very compact shopping centre, as it still does today. In the second half of the 19th century, there was a wish for more shop accommodation close to Briggate. This was also an era in which a more stylish type of shop accommodation was sought. Just as half a century earlier, the projectors of the Bazaar and Shambles had seen the potential of buying up and building on former burgage plots, so too did the Victorian entrepreneurs in the 1870s. Even if the ownership of a burgage plot had become a little fragmented, there was nevertheless the potential to deal with a small number of owners to reassemble it and have a large site which ran right through from Briggate to Lands Lane or from Briggate to Vicar Lane. The first entrepreneur to do this was Charles Thornton, who from about 1872 was the proprietor of the Varieties Music Hall in Swan Street, what we know today as Leeds City Varieties. In 1878, he built Thornton's Arcade on the site of the old Talbot Inn and Yard. Gothic architecture had been firmly established in Leeds by the doyen of Victorian architecture, Sir George Gilbert Scott, who had used it for Beckett's Bank in Park Row in 1862 and for Leeds General Infirmary opened in 1868. So Thornton's Arcade, with its arcade of pointed arches, was the height of fashion. The next arcade to be built was the Queen's Arcade, built between 1888 and 1889. This was named in honour of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee and was erected on the site of the Rose and Crown Yard, another of the great coaching inns. The arcade was also distinguished from Thornton's by the fact that it had a balcony. But the most spectacular improvement of them all involved the creation of the County Arcade. In the 1890s, Leeds Estates Company had the idea of developing the whole of the decrepit and insanitary property on the east side of Briggate, running from the south side of the Bay Horse Yard to the backs of the property on Kergate. You'll hear a lot more about this because this is the subject of my lecture next week. In its day, the impact of the Leeds Estates Company development was rather like that of the Victoria Gate scheme, or indeed the Trinity Shopping Centre today. This luxurious development of shops and leisure amenities comprised the Empire Theatre, which we see on the right here, and the shops and restaurants of King Edward Street and Queen Victoria Street. Its star feature was the County Arcade, which opened in 1900, which was one of the most sumptuous arcades in the country. And one of the most wonderful features of the arcade was the Salon Cafe, which we see here. Here, customers dined and took afternoon tea while its fountain played and a small orchestra entertained them from the balcony. There were tremendous improvements to New Briggate as well in this period. In the 1820s, Corn Exchange was demolished in 1868 and New Briggate was created. The Grand Theatre was built here in 1878, which we see on the right of this postcard. There were considerable hopes for the future of New Briggate. In 1896, the Grand Arcade, which we see just to the left of the Grand Theatre, the Grand Arcade, a twin arcade with sumptuous facades, was built just to the north of the theatre, but was never, and never has been, a commercial success. But notice in this postcard view, there appears to be a large group of buildings in the distance, which certainly don't exist now. Here they are in close-up. Around 1901, this fine parade of mock Tudor shops was built just next door to where the Wren's Public House stands today on the corner of Merrion Street. I'm really sorry, I never saw these buildings. I came to Leeds in 1969, but they'd already been demolished in the 1960s to make way for the inner ring road. The building on the right, incidentally, is still there. So now we move into the 20th century. I'm almost finished. What of Briggate in the 20th century? Here we see the street in 1902 amidst the celebrations on the day the Boer War ended. In terms of architectural splendor and vitality, the Edwardian period was perhaps its heyday. Busy hotels, important shops, arcades, restaurants, theatres, and large amounts of traffic. It really was a street full of life, vigour and interest. The First World War and the depressed economy of the 1920s and 30s, though the Leeds economy comparatively performed pretty well in this period, those years meant that there was little physical change in Briggate, even though it remained vibrant and the heart of the Leeds shopping centre. There were some signs of potential change in 1938, when Sir Henry Price, the 1550 shilling tailor, projected this scheme for the city's first skyscraper, which is where Marks and Spencer's now stands. But the World War II intervened and it was never built. The austerity of the 1950s brought some modernisation and remodelling of what we would now regard as Brigate's historic buildings. But then the booms of the 1960s and 70s brought sufficient funds to start demolishing these buildings on a significant scale. Perhaps the most shocking was MEPC's demolition in the 1970s of that wonderful run of merchant houses on the west side of Lower Briggate. They were demolished to provide space for a shopping centre, which was never built. And sadly, that site is now occupied by a very average looking job centre. It has to be said that the prospects did not look good for Briggate in the 1980s. Its department stores were in decline, out-of-town shopping centres were all the rage, and the question was what could be done with the empty upper floors of Brigate's unfashionable Victorian and Edwardian, perhaps even Georgian buildings. But then a wonderful change came. In 1994, Briggate was closed to private vehicles, and in 1997, it was pedestrianised entirely. Living above the shop became the vogue. Shops amidst the characterful setting of historic buildings suddenly became something in which property developers wanted to invest. The County Arcade was sumptuously refurbished, and the Victoria Quarter was created, as we can see here. In 1996, even Harvey Nichols gave Briggate its seal of approval. At the time I wrote this lecture, first in 2007, though the future of Lower Briggate was not yet secure, the rest of Briggate hummed with shoppers almost as never before. And in fact, despite present-day worries about retail decline, Briggate still hums with shoppers on Saturdays and is really quite busy during the week. Well, I come to my conclusion. One of the major questions in your mind at the moment is, why on earth am I showing you a picture of the Jollibee chicken, burger and spaghetti bar? I'm sure it's a very wonderful institution, though I've never been in it. But the answer comes in the next two slides. A sense of place and continuity, I believe, over the ages is important to us all, and that's why it's so vital to conserve our built heritage. Looking at these two views, it's pleasing to know that the building which until recently on the right was the Samsung shop was actually built almost exactly 2 centuries ago next to the New Corn Exchange, and it is part of the long history of Briggate. In fact, it's been the habit for centuries on Briggate that rather than demolishing buildings when they become unfashionable, they were often remodeled or refronted to look modern and to suit new uses. Now, this is what happened to the building just on the right of the Samsung shop. You can only see part of the Joe of Jollibee. Indeed, it was refronted in the early 20th century and eventually became the Jollibee Burger Bar today. But the question is, how old is the Jollibee building? What is truly amazing is that when it was converted to a McDonald's burger bar in 1995, the alterations exposed the timber framing of a late 16th century house. And you can see it here. Though covered up, this timber framing remains in place today. I have to say, I find it wonderfully reassuring to know that when my fellow citizens and their children sit eating their burgers and spaghetti in Jollibee today, they're sitting in a building sited on half of an 800-year-old burgage plot and in a building in which John Harrison and Richard Sykes may well have sat eating over 400 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was absolutely fascinating. And just while you catch your breath before we go into questions, just to note that we had 280 people attending today, and including someone from West Virginia.
Fantastic.
So that's interesting to know. I picked out 5 questions for you from the notes that have been coming in.
Okay.
The first one is, what happened to the waterway, which we noticed was named Falkingham on one of the maps? I think this is the waterway coming down.
Yes. This is the 1560 map. Basically, of course, people powered water mills off these streams, sometimes continuations of Meanwood Beck as it came down into the city centre. And of course, if somebody upstream put a water mill in, then basically this would mean the water supply to your mill would be adversely affected. So in 1560, there was this legal case disputing whether, Falkingham's mill was permitted, whether it was legal and so on. And so that is the, yes, Falkingham owned the sort of little manor within the manor of North Hall.
Okay, thanks. The second question is, did the Knights Templar have any influence in the development of Briggate? I know there is a Templar cross in one of the yards.
Yes, I mean the fascinating thing about this is that within Leeds Township, within on Briggate and within the heart of the Leeds Township, there are properties which, for certain reasons, became part of the Manor of Whitkirk. And so, Manor of Whitkirk, and in that case, they had rights, or indeed the Manor of Leeds Kirkgate. And in order to ensure that they didn't have to grind their corn in the manorial corn mill, they put Templar crosses, these of course date from the Manor of Whitkirk and Temple Newsome, put Templar crosses on their building, which they hoped proved that they were exempt from grinding their corn at the manorial corn mill. Now, I mean, what's fascinating about this is that, of course, there were legal disputes about this over a period of 200 or 300 years. And even in the 1820s, the owner of the King's Mills, or the chap who farmed the King's Mills, he ran it, tried to sue various people for not grinding their corn at the mill. And there was a wonderful notice in the Leeds Intelligencer newspaper saying to its readers that, and of course it tells you something about the readers, it said, now, you must remind your servants when they go to buy flour that they check that this is flour that has been ground at the King's Mills. That is if their properties were properly within the manor of Leeds, as opposed to other sub-manors.
Okay, thanks. Someone asked where the word shambles originates and what it means.
Well, I think the answer to that is, of course, shambles was a term that was used all over the country, and in the Middle Ages, of course, was associated with butchers and well, we'll say a lot. I'll say a lot more about this next week, but effectively, I'm not sure what the derivation of the term was originally, but we all know what it means today. But specifically in the earlier centuries, it did mean where the butchers slaughtered animals and chopped up meat.
Yeah. The next one is it was a comment on possible hygiene problems in the congested yards of Briggate.
Yes.
Of sewage and cholera and such like.
Yes. Oh, whoa, well, yes. Well, let me say this is like a trailer for next week, isn't it? But of course, the next week's lecture is all about the insanitary state of the yards, and although we know about the state of, say, something like the boot and shoe yard in off Kirkgate in the 1830s, when there was the big cholera epidemic, the Briggate yards, of course, were almost as bad. And well, the state, well, you'll see next week, the state of the yards on the east side of Briggate in the 1860s and earlier was absolutely appalling, and it had very, very interesting consequences.
Okay, last one on the 1500 map. The word Salian appears.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to know what it means.
Yeah, basically the academics don't generally refer to ridge and furrow strips. Basically, a Salian is a ridge and furrow strip. So that, yes, so we were being slightly posh, you see, when we wrote the illustrated history of Leeds, and we put at the top of that plan the Salians. But I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is when we talk about the hedgerow, basically the ridge and furrow strips came right down to the hedgerow, and the hedgerow was the head street, as it were, running across the top of certainly the manorial borough. And immediately beyond there, you were out into the ridge and furrow fields. And also, of course, Lands Lane, the lands, that is another word for Salians in effect. And so when you walked up Lands Lane, you were going into the open fields and the system of strip farming.
Right, interesting. Well, thanks very much for this, and we're now looking forward to next week, and the title is When the Streets Ran with Blood, Butchers, Slaughterhouses and Cattle Markets. I noticed murder's not mentioned there. So.
Murder? You didn't? Well, can I work up the bottle? Well, who knows? Anyway, but anyway, I can.
Right. Well, thanks very much, and thank you everyone for attending today, and we hope to see you next week.
Can I just say one more thing, Mark? And that is, of course, the Civic Trust produced a guidebook to Briggate, which Peter Breers and I wrote. It's a walkabout guide, and I'd be very much surprised if the Trust doesn't still have some copies of this. So I think it was about £5, but nicely done, I think. So if people are interested, they might well contact the Trust about that.
Okay, we'll have to look that up. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, and goodbye.
Goodbye.